basis with the caveats that they may well change their mind.
Which is not different to their interim guidance on height-sensitive areas and volcanic view shafts where they hadn't completed.
Slightly different because that hearing had actually commenced and then was adjourned and then the guidance came out. Yeah, slightly different. This was a bit earlier. Yeah, view shafts, they'd actually started the hearing on the view shafts.
That's true. Thank you.
The rules, and adjourned the hearing. Yep. Mr. Mayor?
Yeah, just so following on behind Wayne's sort of comment question. So just can you reflect back to me whether the submissions or the interim guidance reflected the fact that we have in effect a mesh block operating, which is basically the our urban regeneration or development plan through the unitary plan overlaid by the transport plan. So do you see a strong connectivity between those two, particularly as they go to rapid transit networks and all that sort of thing? You know, if we, you know, are looking at the possibility of greater compact growth around our suburban retail commercial sectors, ideally they should be linking up with our rapid transit networks, buses, ferries for coastal networks, walkways, cycleways, etc. So just give us some reflections on whether or not there was a lot of guidance or comment back about the connectivity or the intermeshing of those two key focuses.
There wasn't a lot in the interim guidance per se, but I think the panel accepted that obviously transport is a key part of the urban form, and where you're locating your commercial activities and centres, you want that to be strong transport hubs, so you can make use of the public transport that goes along with that. And the growth corridors are another step beyond that, in the sense that they're trying to get larger numbers of large format retail activities in one area, so you don't have multi-trips all around the region, and you're restricting it to a single corridor, preferably with public transport on it to enable access for people who wish to use public transport.
Just to follow that up, so one of the things that we've done at really the same time as we're going through this unitary plan process is that we've done a massive review of our bus network operation. So have we accounted for that in our final submissions?
Yes, all the evidence that Council presented was on the basis of the future transport network becoming operative, you know, in 2025. So we're looking at the planned frequent transport network, and so that was all taken into account as part of the Council's
You actually have made a lot of changes to the proposed bus schedules that went out. I mean, how they reschedule, I suspect, will have quite a significant impact on people's movement in and around our commercial and social centres. So just a note, John.
Yeah, well, Mr. Mayor, if I could just make a comment that, yeah, there's always a little bit of an iterative approach to any sort of infrastructure planning and land use planning, and they're not always 100% perfectly in sync. And I think with the transport network, we've worked with Auckland Transport through these hearings on all the topics to try and make sure we're as aligned as possible, but sometimes, you know, there may be a need to review the unitary plan in the future if there are some situations where the transport, you know, because it won't necessarily be fixed forever. So you just have to be nimble enough to get as close as you possibly can to align transport and infrastructure to the best of your knowledge and ability at the point in time. But if there are reasons to change one, then the other just needs to catch up. So it's a bit like that. But I think they're very close in terms of where we got to at the hearings.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, Jeremy. I think we're ready to go to... Oh, sorry, Councillor Wood.
Yeah, just in relation to those commercial activities and the panel's interim guidance on page 29, and you're talking. I'm talking about transport corridors again.
Yes.
Is that when you're saying transport corridors and you mention Wairau Road? Is that just the transport? I mean, how do you define the transport corridor there?
Well, I must admit, when the panel gave their guidance, the submitters were a little bit, we didn't quite understand what they meant by supporting commercial growth on transport corridors, because that was their language and it wasn't clear to us what that actually meant. Did they mean 1 or 2 transport corridors? Did they mean every transport corridor? So it was kind of unclear. But at the district plan hearings, we discussed that with the panel, and they clarified that they were talking about specifically identified growth corridors. So the concept of identifying growth corridors for large format retail in a few locations around the area was something that they, at that time, supported.
Yeah, okay. They didn't give you, I mean, what's the width of a corridor, or is that just a subjective thing on each, and each one have to be looked at on its merits?
That's exactly right. You know, you're looking at transport, you're looking at the existing environment, you're looking at surrounding residential, you're looking at a range of things, whether there's access to good public transport. So you're looking at a range of criteria to assess whether a corridor in that area would be appropriate. And, you know, one of the things you're also looking at is whether there is plenty of land around there for retail activities already. Do we even need any more retail activities along that corridor, because we've got a metropolitan centre and town centre next door with space in them? And council did a lot of work through the REMU department, identifying areas of Auckland where there were surpluses or deficits in terms of the ability to provide for the projected retail growth. And in the end, they came out with a recommended 5 corridors. Submitters wanted a few more.
Okay, so obviously resource consent, you could go for a resource consent if you were in close proximity to these areas.
Yep, the corridors were all mapped on GIS, so if you're within that mapped area, then, for example, a large format retail activity would be a restricted discretionary activity. You'd be looking at transport amongst other things, but also the effect on centres and whether that would have an adverse effect on those centres.
So does the centre's policies of previous former councils still have bearing on these transport corridor situations?
Well, I guess they do at the moment, but when the unitary plan, fingers crossed, becomes operative, then the unitary plan will take precedence.
Thank you, Councillor. Jeremy, I think you've answered everybody's queries. Thank you for that. We'll move from business to rural, and I think we've got Bain Cross and Barry Mosley. Welcome, gentlemen.
All right.
John, you'll take us through.
So
There's quite a few slides here, I think.
probably more slides on this than the previous 3, and to be honest, this is actually one of the most challenging topics in the unitary plan, rural. Possibly not the most contentious in terms of the number of submitters, because obviously more people living in urban Auckland, but there's some pretty thorny issues out there in rural Auckland that certainly the Legacy, Franklin and Rodney councils, and Manukau as well, have been grappling with, and the former regional council for many years. So where do we get to with the regional policy statement? Well, there's a section on sustainably managing our rural environment. There are 3 key themes that run through this presentation. The first one is rural activities, and by that we mean things like ensuring that rural production continues to make a significant contribution to Auckland's economy, and that it's protected from inappropriate subdivision use and development. So that's the key regional policy statement thrust around what happens in rural areas from an activity point of view. In terms of land with high productive potential, the regional policy statement talked about retaining both elite soils, which are mapped, and also prime soils for primary production, as opposed to housing or other non-rural uses, and minimise its loss as a result of subdivision development. And lastly, the other big thorny topic is rural subdivision. And the approach in the regional policy statement is to manage that subdivision to ensure that the productive potential of rural Auckland is not compromised. So that's sitting up there at the regional policy statement. Getting down into the rules, there were 5 proposed rural zones. The main one, most extensive one, is the general rural production zone. As you'd imagine, it allows for a wide range of rural production activities and intensive farming. Then we have the mixed rural zone, which also enables a wide range of rural production, but you'll tend to see in these areas smaller sites. There's a bit more what we call fragmentation of the land, or smaller sites basically. In these areas, there's a bit more commercial activity. There's some existing rural lifestyle in the mixed rural areas of Auckland, and the provisions in the plan anticipate a greater variety of activities than you might see in the rural production zone. Then in coastal areas, we have mapped the rural coastal zone, properties in many cases that immediately abut the coastal marine area, and in some cases further inland. Again, enables general rural production, but resource consents are often required in the rural coastal zone, not because of the zone itself, but there are often landscape overlays, like the outstanding natural landscapes sitting over properties in the rural coastal zone, which tend to call in things like greenhouses for a resource consent because of their impact on landscapes. Then we have the countryside living areas, generally around or near more urban areas or rural and coastal settlements, providing for rural lifestyle development. And last but not least, least in terms of the extensive mapping of it, the rural conservation zone, predominantly in the Waitakere Ranges area, some I think in the Hanua Ranges as well. None at all, Blaine says. So it's pretty much all in Waitakere Ranges. Enables rural activities and some residential activities, but a very conservative approach to activities in this area. We also have, Kawa Island and Waiti. So that was the zones. So just taking the theme of rural activities, they're generally enabled in the rural production, mixed rural and rural coastal zones, and by that we're talking about farmings permitted, forestry, greenhouses, intensive farming, poultry, piggeries, and equestrian. Pretty permissive approach to all of those in those three zones. Residential amenity is recognised as having some importance in the countryside living areas, but in other rural zones the emphasis is very much on productive rural use rather than protecting residents from noise and so on. Simple bulk and location controls for rural activities, very simple suite of controls, and related activities to rural activities generally have to go through a resource consent. Things like tourist and visitor accommodation, cafes and so on, garden centres have a resource consent path. They're not permitted as of right in rural areas. Moving on to land with high productive potential, the notified plan had quite strict controls in place to protect that land, elite and prime land, from subdivision and development. They favour rural production on that land and also provisions to minimise reverse sensitivity adjacent to land with high productive potential, and strict controls to minimise that fragmentation or splitting up prime productive land into smaller titles, and provisions to encourage the amalgamation of sites that have high productive potential. Related to that, rural subdivision, the overall approach in the notified plan was to reduce any further fragmenting of sites or creation of new sites in rural Auckland as a whole, and maintain the productive potential of the land for all good economic reasons. Overall strategy of no net increase in the number of sites in rural Auckland, and if you look at the maps of rural Auckland, there are many, many sites that were subdivided many, many years ago, so there's plenty of potential already for housing to establish on many of those sites that have been sitting there dormant for many years, so there's certainly not an undersupply of rural properties, but general subdivision was provided for in the countryside living zone. So just to sort of expand on that subdivision with a little bit more detail, it was a prohibited activity in the rural production or the mixed rural zone to subdivide land into anything less than 150 hectares, which is obviously huge, unless you were amalgamating two adjacent sites or two or more adjacent sites. You could transfer a title to another part of rural Auckland, or there was also a provision to protect Indigenous biodiversity and be able to subdivide as a result of doing that. And there were some technical provisions to allow for shifting of boundaries in rural Auckland to enable them to fit to the existing rural activity that was happening on the land. In terms of rural coast and rural conservation, much more restrictive. General subdivision was just simply prohibited, and there was no ability to amalgamate or transfer into these areas, or I think out of these areas, through amalgamation or protection of vegetation, but there was that boundary adjustment provision in those zones as well. Countryside living, as you'd expect, potential for subdivision, specific minimums for all the different countryside living parts of Auckland that were largely rolled over from the operative district plans. The operative district plans had their own specific subdivision minimum lot sizes for many of these areas, and they were largely rolled over. But there was that ability to go smaller than the minimum site size in countryside living if you were transferring an amalgamated title from a general rural production area or a mixed rural area, and development controls to require the building platform to be shown as part of a subdivision scheme plan. I think the minimum lot sizes were generally sort of 2 or 4 hectares, and then there was that potential to go smaller, down to a hectare in some cases, through the transfer or the vegetation protection controls. So the submitters, where they were coming from in terms of the rural activities, the council's enabling approach to rural activities was largely supported. Some wanted to refine the provisions rather than challenge the overall approach. Some wanted a more permissive approach to subsidiary dwellings related to the main dwelling on a rural property, more enabling provisions for workers' accommodation, post-harvest facilities, and outdoor rural tourist and visitor activities. So definitely some submissions asking for more flexibility for the list of activities in that last bullet point there. Moving on to subdivision, quite polarised views, I guess. Some strongly in support, some strongly in opposition to the council's approach. Support and opposition to this transferable rural site subdivision approach, where you can amalgamate 2 adjacent rural titles and then create a new title somewhere else and get a benefit from doing that.